Today we're going to talk a bit about geometry in biology, and that is not me misspeaking. We're actually going to do it because we need to talk about cell size. So, cells often function based off of diffusion. Once a particle enters the cell, it's going to diffuse through the cytoplasm to try and reach the area where it's needed. And oftentimes, if it's using something up, that'll be the area with the lowest concentration because it's constantly being used up. The advantage of this passive diffusion is that it doesn't take any energy, but the disadvantage is that it does take time. And the time that it takes is often not huge, but it can actually be surprisingly long depending on what the chemical is. Like, we know that our bodies are about 80% water, but to get oxygen to diffuse from our mouth to our toes would take years, if not decades. It takes a very long time for oxygen to diffuse, especially through water, because oxygen is kind of like oil. It's non-polar, but water is polar. So we can't always rely on diffusion. And the concentration gradients inside of the cell aren't actually that big because the cells are so tiny and there's so much going on inside of them. So they're useful, they're powerful tools at the biological level. They're not exactly fast, at least not as fast as our metabolisms are. So the rate of diffusion ends up being slow. And what this means is that cells have to remain small. If a cell gets too big, then the ratio between its surface area and its volume is going to slow down passive diffusion even further. And this is why we tend not to see gigantic cells. There are some gigantic cells. Your muscle cells are very large, your neurons are very large, but they are very particularly adapted in order to do that. There are some species of visible amoebas that are single cellular, but they are very much the exception rather than the rule, and they have to work very hard to maintain their cells the way they are. So the reason that all of this works is this way is because motion is random. So diffusion won't necessarily mean that the cell takes the easiest route, and it also is going to be very, very, very slow. So if we had a cell that was about 1.5 meters long, it would take a week for a substance to go from the cell's surface to the cell's inner center to reach the nucleus. And if you're relying on that to send a message for something that needs to be corrected immediately, the cell is going to die because you can't take a week for a message that needs to go immediately. So as the cell grows, this happens because the volume of the cell increases much faster than its surface area. And this actually, you can do it the same way with two-dimensional objects as well. If you take a look at a circle and you try and measure its circumference, and then you measure its area as well, and then you make a bigger circle and measure its circumference and its area, the bigger circle's area is going to have increased much, much, much more than its circumference does. So the important thing for cells is that it means that they are going to take longer to send messages within themselves, but it also means that they're going to need exponentially more supplies. A 2 millimeter wide cell actually takes 8 times the nutrients of a 1 millimeter wide cell. The surface area is only 4 times bigger, but the volume is 8 times bigger. So there's actually 8 times the material within the cell. If it's not able to get all that food, it will starve, or alternatively, it might not be able to transport all of the waste out of the cell, and it could become poisoned and die. So because of this, there is a practical limit on how big cells can get. And if cells get larger than that limit, they put themselves in a very dangerous position where they are at risk of either starving or getting poisoned. The other important thing about surface area, though, is that in areas where the cell needs to interact with its environment, what we often start to see is we start to see elongated shapes. This cross section is actually from the small intestine, and these aren't individual cells, they are groups of cells known as villi. But what the villi are doing here is they're increasing their surface area by forming all of the cells in them into these long extensions. So these structures have much higher surface area, and that gives more space for the cell to interact with its environment. So sometimes we do see cells with very elongated shapes instead of the circles or squares that we often imagine them as, and that actually allows it to react to its environment. It can react and interact more frequently, which is very useful for cells.